The First World War had come to an end, with the Entente Powers led by France and Britain having come out victorious. There was much patriotic rejoice throughout the whole of France, citizens glad that this conflict was finally over. Soldiers came back from the war in droves, but this presented its own issues. 6 million soldiers are now back in France, with most of them now searching for jobs on the market, which struggled to accommodate such a sudden increase in the labor pool. Many charities and organizations were set up early on to support the returning soldiers. Even still, there would be many who early on did not enjoy success, and they would turn to other ways to express their grievances. During the war, membership of labor unions, such as the CGT, had greatly increased, but in the wake of the soldiers coming home, labor union membership surged to an even greater extent. For example, the CGT's membership would triple in this time, and late in the year, the more conservative elements of the labor movement would come together to form the French Confederation of Christian Workers. The returning soldiers, however, were not universally left-wing in their sentiments, with many being motivated by nationalism after having risked so much of their country during the war. The national administration, led by George Clemenceau, was left terrified by these developments. When he had been in power a decade earlier, Clemenceau had been happy to crush any strikes that were attempted by labor groups. But that was at a time when labor groups were very small, something that was no longer the case. Clemenceau and those that surrounded him were terrified of the possibility of communist revolution coming to France, as over the previous 2 years communist revolts had broken out all across Europe. The most famous was in Russia, of course, but major communist uprisings had also occurred in Germany and what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the end, Clemenceau's government opted to give concessions to the trade unions. In spring 1919, the right to collectively bargain would be legally enshrined, and an 8-hour, 6-day workweek would be established. The unions, though, were not satisfied, and sensing weakness, launched the most vicious strikes in the history of the country in May 1919, hoping for even more concessions. That following June, Clemenceau intervened in what once was the Austro-Hungarian Empire against the newly formed Hungarian Soviet Republic, which the CGT would respond with by calling a general strike that grinded the country to a halt, which forced Clemenceau to negotiate. It was agreed that the strike would be called off in exchange for Clemenceau being in the process of bringing troops home. Despite the concessions they had gained, these waves of strike worked to decrease the popularity of the labor unions among the non-unionized and helped to increase Clemenceau's popularity among the general public. The other big issue the government faced in the wake of the end of the war was that of women's suffrage. In nearly all of the countries that had partook in the war, the mass drafting of able-bodied young men had left many crucial domestic jobs and factories unfilled, which led to many of them being filled by women, who for many of them would mark the first time they would enter the workforce. This caused a renewed call for women's suffrage, and women's groups all over the political spectrum would fight for such a reform. Their efforts had been successful all around the Western world. The new constitution, adopted by Republican Germany in 1919, granted men and women the equal right to vote, and the following year the United States would ratify the 19th Amendment that did the same thing. In 1918, the United Kingdom also granted women the right to vote, although equal voting rights would not be granted until amendments made in 1928. All this put great pressure on the House of Deputies to pass a similar law to grant women the vote, and it would do so overwhelmingly, with women's rights groups celebrating the news. They however ignored the fact that the bill had passed with nearly 200 abstentions. The bill's Senate vote would be delayed as much as possible, where the chamber's left-wing Republican majority would vote to send the law back to committee, where it would be promptly killed. The killing of the bill would come as a great surprise to many, but a sense of elitist opposition from left-wing Republican men to women's suffrage did not waver. In their view, giving women the right to vote would only empower the right, as women tended to be much more religious and were less involved in the labor movement, an argument that persuaded many to keep the vote away from them. Over the spring of 1919, while this was all occurring, the House of Deputies was busy drafting a new electoral bill, one that would work to replace the 2-round single-member system that had been used in every legislative election in the Third Republic with the exception of 1885. They came back with a new law that would implement a proportional list representation system, very similar to one that had been used in the election of 1885. Under this system, parties would present electoral lists in each department, with each department having at least 3 deputies, with the resulting elections being at least nominally proportional. In reality, this law hugely promoted majoritarian rule, as lists that obtained a majority in a particular department would be guaranteed 1 deputy, before the remaining would be divided proportionally. With the number of small departments there were in France, it was easy for a large electoral list to sweep most if not all of the deputies in many departments against a divided opposition. Ahead of the election that would be happening in November 1919, the right and center in the House would come together to form the very large coalition that the new electoral law would aid to support Clemenceau's premiership. This grand coalition would be initiated by the centrist Democratic Alliance, which over the war under the leadership of President Raymond Poincaré had moved to the right. Despite having initially allied with the left, the Democratic Alliance would now join up with a conservative Republican Federation and Liberal Action, which had always been allied to one another. The independent radicals led by George Clemenceau too opted to join this coalition, which broke them away from the Radical Party for the first time. The coalition would in addition include several independents who wished to keep some form of the Sacred Union coalition alive, such as Alexandre Millerand. Together, all these various parties formed the National Bloc. The new leader of the Radical Party, Edouard Herriot, the mayor of Lyon, refused cooperation with the Bloc over the inclusion of the conservatives, who he felt were too religiously inspired. This would mark the first time the Radicals were out of government since before the election of 1898. This left the Radicals as well as the Republican Socialist Party on their own, as the SFIO2, now led by Ludovic Oscar Frossard, opted to run their own independent lists in each department. This forced the left to be very divided going into the election, with the only sort of unity existing being joint lists run by the Radical Party and the Republican Socialist Party in some departments, although not in all. This election campaign would come to be very contentious, as not only was there an election for the national parliament, but just after there would take place elections for local city councils and the general councils of each department, which too had been temporarily suspended during the war. Throughout the electoral campaign, the National Bloc ran hard against the supposed Bolshevism of the SFIO and of the trade unions. This attack was especially poignant since the SFIO never denounced the Bolsheviks, as the party was divided over their opinion on them, with a more moderate, explicitly anti-Bolshevik faction being in the minority. Any attempts to officially denounce the Bolsheviks were blocked by Froissart, who did not want to denounce the only socialist success that he could observe. The bloc also called for a strict implementation of the Versailles Treaty that had been adopted that summer and any future treaties, and called for a swift transition into a peacetime economy, which in their view would involve a lot of deregulation. The SFIO ran a pretty standard campaign, aligning themselves with the trade unions and demanding further concessions to be given to the working classes. The Radical Party and the Republican Socialist Party struggled from the same issue that had plagued the right in the elections of 1910 and 1914, as they struggled to offer a truly independent vision, as they were caught in between the National Bloc and the Socialists. Herriot continued to emphasize anti-clericalism, but in this political climate, the issue failed to pick up steam. Now let's see the results. In a massive shakeup, the National Bloc achieved victory, and a gigantic one at that. In total, they won 412 seats and 53.4% of the vote, a victory that granted them more than 2/3 of parliament's seats and effective total domination of the chamber. Nearly every party in the bloc had increased their seat count, and they did so by significant amounts. The only exception had been the Liberal Action, that due to their mediocre results agreed to fuse into the Republican Federation following this election. This election marked the first time the right had achieved a decisive victory since the legislative election of 1893. The bloc had been aided by a low turnout rate, which almost definitely advantaged them, as well as the fact that due to all the deaths that had taken place during the war, the average voter was much older than they had been at the last election. The SFIO had come second in a popular vote, winning 21%, but came third in seats, only winning 68. They had increased their support from a previous election, but their gains had been limited by the National Bloc successfully staining them by tying them to Bolshevism. Despite their impressive result, Froissart had failed to get himself elected, as the National Bloc successfully swept nearly all the seats in Senate, the department he was running in. The center-left alliance of the Radical Party and the Republican Socialists had come second in the seat count, winning a total of 112, which put them ahead of the SFIO, but not by enough to matter. The alliance had been hurt by internal division, as well as their initial exclusion from a governing coalition for the first time in over 20 years. Overall, the National Bloc had done the best in traditionally conservative areas that happily rewarded the bloc with their votes. It also significantly had done very well in the newly acquired Alsace-Lorraine, whose voters overwhelmingly backed the bloc. Soon after the election, a new presidential election would take place, and George Clemenceau would throw his hat into the ring. And Clemenceau would, to a huge surprise, be defeated. Following this disaster, he stepped down as prime minister, and he would also give up a seat he held in the French Senate. He would never enter public life again, which ended his long political career. Even though retired, Clemenceau still had an eventful life, and he would travel and meet with many important political leaders in his final years. He would pass away on the 24th of November 1929 at the age of 88 from an acute kidney injury. Even today, Clemenceau is remembered as one of the most impactful leaders in France's history. Following Clemenceau's departure, the office of Prime Minister would pass to Alexandre Millerand, who for a previous year had been appointed to lead the reintegration of Alsace-Lorraine into the Republic. And he had also effectively led the 1919 electoral campaign, as Clemenceau's age had prevented him from campaigning effectively. The bloc had been gifted an enormous majority, one that would allow any prime minister from its ranks to dominate French politics. Alexandre Millerand had a big chip on his shoulder as he took office. He would need to continue to heal the wounds that France had suffered over the war, maintain harmony in French society, and effectively execute the treaties that had been agreed upon by the Paris Peace Conference. I hope to see you all next time for the election of 1924, when we can assess how they did. See you then!